Marvel Snap's newest card, Symbiote Spider-Man, is one of the most confusing deck building puzzles I have ever tried to solve. I am fresh off my Infinite Climb and a little bit more playing afterwards. I'm currently rank 8 at the time of recording this video. Let's talk about what I learned about Symbiote Spider-Man and then decks to best explore his power going forward. So, what does this guy do exactly? Symbiote Spider-Man is a 4/6 with an Activate ability, the first card in Marvel Snap to have one of those. An Activate ability requires the card to be face up on the board and also to hold down a long press in order to make it happen. What this does with Symbiote Spider-Man is make him effectively a force multiplier. That is the role this card has, because his ability effectively allows on reveals to happen multiple times, and it can also be used to fuse with cards like Nimrod so that it is able to grow multiplicatively. The way this card works effectively in almost all of the decks I play it is that it is meant to either multiply an early on reveal, I think a Sage would be a good example of what it can do, or multiply something that it is using it as big Hulkbuster. And there's such a wide variety of decks because it's so hard to know what the proper amount of investment in this card actually is. The major issue this card has is because it targets the lowest cost, it has a really defined weakness to clog strategies, which are both popular and strong right now. Many decks are running cards like White Widow and Kate Bishop, which can kind of instantly blow you out of the water. Kate Bishop's Acid Arrow is especially problematic for this card because if you get Acid Arrowed when you try to activate, what's going to happen is you're going to activate onto the Acid Arrow, send over a 4-power Symbiote Spider-Man to your opponent, generally cry and lose the game. Now, all of this is to say, the way this card is being built now, a lot of people are going very all in. I think the best ways to build this card are going to be going less all in, but hybridizing with the ability to get the output of an all-in deck without investing in it as much as it would be needed. Because between the Clog cards and Cosmo, I do think that this card has some very defined weaknesses. Cosmo, even though it doesn't work on activates, again, most of what this card is doing is on reveal related. Cosmo is actually usually very good into it. Let's start with a fairly straightforward attempt at a Wong deck with Symbiote Spider-Man. Now, I know there are going to be a lot of different builds, a lot of different attempts to do what this card is attempting to do in the Wong shell, but let's go over a couple of the lines you have available to you. First of all, we all know how powerful Wong Sage is. Well, if you're able to set up a situation where you can Symbiote Spider-Man Sage, that is almost as strong. Second of all, you have a secondary line here. That line is playing Symbiote Spider-Man, playing Black Panther next to Symbiote Spider-Man, activating Symbiote Spider-Man onto the Black Panther, and then playing Arnim Zola. If a deck can't interact with this, either through Clog or Cosmo, you have 56 points on the other locations. This is a hybridization of what is already a powerful deck, adding in that effective 3-card combo to give it just free wins over other decks. The Wong stuff is already fairly reasonably strong, and while it does not necessarily cover for Symbiote Spider-Man's weaknesses to Clog, to Cosmo, it does manage to provide enough flexibility that I think that this is how you want to be building the deck. I've seen people get a little bit deeper here, right? Playing Galactus stuff. That's definitely a thing you can do, but I think that leans even more into the weaknesses this card has to Cosmo and to Clog. I'd rather be something closer to a more functional mid-range deck because in the absolute worst case scenario with Symbiote Spider-Man in this deck, you are putting it on a Nightcrawler, you are putting it on a Jeff, you are putting it on a Nocturne. Those are powerful, movable cards. A build your own vision is the worst case scenario for this card, and that is something that makes me feel good about having this card in here. That's the worst case. The best case is 56 power in 2 locations, which is very hard to beat. This is a reasonably powerful deck that is doing a lot of strong things already. Yes, there are some fairly defined weaknesses, but they are not nearly enough necessarily, in my opinion, to make this an actual bad choice. I think it's a very solid level 1, day 1 deck. The other frontrunner here is pretty obvious. It's Phoenix Force, and Phoenix Force is part of why you're actually happy to have that 56 power combo in the other deck, because this deck has no way of interacting with it at all, and so you get to just sort of crush these combo decks every single time you draw that, which is a very cool space to be in, because these combo decks are sort of built to crush small decks. You get to be the combo crusher with that Wong deck. I think it's kind of a nice interaction there. But this deck is effectively using Symbiote Spider-Man as extra ability to create Nimrod. You can also, and this is important, because move works in the way that it does, when you move a Phoenix Force multiple man to a location, Symbiote Spider-Man will happen after it every single time, which means you will likely be able to, if you can make this happen, get a Symbiote Spider-Man onto your Phoenix Force as well. Suddenly you're moving around even more stuff. Like, you can do your normal line, like a multiple man into Venom into Phoenix Force, and then you can play a Symbiote Spider-Man, and then you can activate the Symbiote Spider-Man on the final turn of the game and, like, Ghost Spider that multiple man. Like, it's kind of a little complicated because of the ways move works. But if you can make sure you're targeting the correct multiple man, you can actually make that work. The major thing this is actually doing, though, and this is, like, fairly obvious, I think, is being second Shuri for your Nimrod game plan. Your Nimrod game plan now is much, much more convincing in this list, and that makes it a very, very powerful and strong method of adding consistency to a list that was already powerful, but fundamentally did lack consistency. You now have multiple combo lines. It's not just the Phoenix Force, it's also Shuri into Nimrod. Now it's also Symbiote Spider-Man into Nimrod. Effectively, an additional combo line gets added to the deck at almost no cost. This was already basically a free slot in the deck that many people were running Iron Lad in. Symbiote Spider-Man is a massive upgrade over Iron Lad, and genuinely, Phoenix Force might be the single deck that benefits the most from the addition of this card. A friend of mine, Dopest Body, a perennial top 10 gamer, cooked this list up, and it really caught my eye. Now, you might think, what the hell is going on here? What is Symbiote Spider-Man actually doing? What is the Grandmaster actually doing? Here's what Grandmaster Symbiote Spider-Man is doing. If you can set up the correct situation, and by that I mean Grandmaster is the cheapest card in your lane, you can play a Doctor Doom or an Alioth in a side lane, activate Symbiote Spider-Man onto the Grandmaster, and get a second Doctor Doom or Alioth into the mid lane. That's really strong. That is just a really powerful, really strong thing to do. And I think it's worth noting that this is already a deck that is good. There is nothing actively bad in this deck. It's just straightforwardly good cards doing good card stuff. You are a Wiccan deck, which gives you another angle to use the Grandmaster. In other words, you can now do, Alioth Grandmaster or Doctor Doom Grandmaster. You can do a lot of stuff in this shell. You do lack interaction with, a lot of things that are just not vulnerable to Alioth. Like, you still have the fundamental problems that Wiccan decks do, but you have this additional surprise factor that I think people aren't really expecting, especially with the Doom. Many people are going to be able to, when they're good at the game, play around your double Alioth because every Wiccan deck runs Alioth. Not every Wiccan deck runs Doom, and doubling Doom is a very powerful thing to do. You can do it multiple ways. If you're able to keep a lane clear or have your movers be in a lane and then move them out, you can just play Doom into Symbiote Spider-Man, and that's 2 Dooms right there. If you're able to do it with the Grandmaster, you can do even more like that. That's a very powerful play as well. And that's what this deck is trying to do. It's taken my classic advice, which is when you have a deck like this, when you have a new card that you're not really sure what to do with, add it as part of a package to something that is already good. Classic KM Best style deck building. I really enjoyed playing this list. Dagger Clog is a deck that kind of just had a free splot, so I wanted to try Symbiote Spider-Man in it. I did notice that I said splot instead of spot there. I'm leaving it in. You can deal with it. I don't really care. Deal with it. All right, so this deck is effectively using it as a Sage force multiplier. That's really what's happening here. Almost everything we're trying to do here is as a doubled Sage, and that's a really strong thing to do. Like, it does genuinely give you a lot of power when you're able to go like Iron Fist Dagger, Sage, Sage, right? So like you get the 12 somewhere, you get the Sage into the Symbiote Spider-Man lane. It's hard to lose when you have 2 Sage procs. It really is. Now you do have to have a lot of care towards where you're placing your units. For that reason, Beast can be helpful, but you really do need to plan out how your whole game is gonna go. Now that said, Symbiote Spider-Man, not really an all-star here. I think we're getting into the decks where it's like, you can run SSM in here, but he's not a star the way he is in the first ones that we talked about. And I think this deck fairly reasonably falls into that category. The reason I'm including it is because it's good, and SSM felt pretty solid in it. It might be a card you could have a better option for, but I'm not actually sure. I really am not sure. It felt to me like it was better than Ravonna. And I realize that's like kind of a low bar. Ravonna was not the world's greatest card in here, but it did feel meaningfully good to be able to have another beefy boy threat that just was able to do some stuff. It's not amazing. It's not the greatest card on earth, and you don't always get everything you want out of it. But having a card that just says, hey, Sage is actually just way bigger than they ever think it is, that's pretty good for me. You can also use this to duplicate White Widows, also a pretty good thing to do. Like, it's just a nice utility piece in a deck that tends to lack plays on certain turns of the game, where you just want something that's going to be like reasonably playable, because your 5 and 6 are often so very like done for you. If you're going to be the Ajax gamer, you play that on 5. If you're not going to be an Ajax gamer, you do Beast stuff on 5. And then your 6 is just the rest of your stuff. And so Symbiote Spider-Man is just like a card that you're generally happy to have and get something out of. I don't think he's in any way required to play this. I said my day one theory of Symbiote Spider-Man was just jam him in Sandman and see if he's all right. And he is all right, right? One of the things that this deck has going for it is that a lot of people are trying to answer Symbiote Spider-Man with Clog stuff. This deck does not super care about getting clogged. It's really not playing that many cards anyway. If you end up making the Symbiote Spider-Man Dr. Doom line worthless, that's fine. We don't really care. And there are going to be situations where the Sim Spider-Man Dr. Doom line ends up being actively good. Here's the issue, though. I did not feel like Symbiote Spider-Man was a meaningful improvement over anything else I could have run. And that's not to say he's bad in this deck. I think he's honestly like probably fine. He does the thing where you save space. That's pretty good. Like, you have a lot of general ability to beat Clog decks because you have Jeff, because you have SSM. You have all this stuff that's like generally pretty good, but you're definitely not maximizing him in here. He's just pretty good. And that's, I think, not what people are looking for from a card like this, but it's worth talking about how a card like this can be pretty good in decks like this without necessarily having to knock it out of the park every time. Yes, you have access to the SSM Doom thing, but mostly this guy is just like a 4/6 that sometimes high rolls. He's not really there to be anything else. He's a 4/6. You can use him to like merge onto your other stuff. That's something you're plenty happy to be doing. Getting a vision off of your Jeff is pretty sick. You're happy to be doing that because you are still a Sandman deck, and reallocating your points on the final turn does matter. But like a lot of the time, it's not going to be meaningfully better than just playing an Ultron anyway. And a lot of the time, you are going to be playing an Ultron anyway. And because Ultron scales better with Patriot, you're just going to have to sit there and live with that. And so when you play this deck, you're not going to feel like he's doing a bunch of amazing stuff, but he is definitely pretty reasonable here. We've talked a little about the power of using Symbiote Spider-Man in order to reactivate cards like Sage. This is a deck that was cooked up by, I believe, Yo Woody and Husky Puppies, and it has a lot of that built into it. The idea here is you are a typical straightforward bounce deck, but you get to reuse just baseline strong cards like Sage, strong cards like Hitmonkey. Doubling your Hitmonkey, very ridiculous to do. And because you are throwing priority so readily, because you are able to put people in these situations where you can't actually deal with stuff, or where they can't actually meaningfully interact with you, you're able to do even things like Rocket Raccoon into Symbiote Spider-Man is pretty damn strong, right? Like, that's effectively making Rocket into a 1/9. That's just like 15 power. Nico Minoru double into Symbiote Spider-Man is 1,000,000,000 points. There are so many little interactions with these small cards that Symbiote Spider-Man makes into very, very powerful things. And so it could possibly be a very reasonable approach to the bounce deck, because I played against this, it felt quite strong. But again, this is another deck where it's like the Symbiote Spider-Man is good, but also bounce was already good. And so it's like we're choosing between Symbiote Spider-Man and Wiccan, and Symbiote Spider-Man is probably better than Wiccan. I've got no issues with that. I think the real thing that Symbiote Spider-Man is bringing to this deck is surprise. It's just really hard to play around this. I don't think people are familiar with it yet. I got someone drop like 37 power in a lane off of a Hitmonkey. Just really, really strong stuff happening when you are able to pull off the SSM line. And Black Swan, even Black Swan's kind of interesting here, right? Because you could get a second Black Swan if you wanted. That's a thing you could play for. And so this deck has a huge amount of points potential, almost no ways to interact with your opponent, and is very much just saying, I would like to try to do more points than you with the power of Symbiote Spider-Man plus Rocket Raccoon or Sage, or, you know, even like a Hitmonkey or whatever. All of this stuff is part of your points output package. You are trying to put points on the board. That is your job. Make sure those points get on the board. Many of you may remember the No-Key deck, a scalar-based deck list that was essentially built to be a high interactivity, high power deck without investing a lot of energy. A deck that is having a bunch of surprise final turn point output is a valuable thing to have in a game like this. And that surprise final turn points output can be a lot of different things in a deck like this. It doesn't have to be literal points. It can be points in the sense that Juggernaut is infinity points some of the times. It can be points in the sense that Cosmo is infinity points some of the time. This is a deck that thrives on the ability to output confusing board states. You can have games where you are able to play a Sage, Symbiote Spider-Man the Sage, Grandmaster that whole thing to the middle, Juggernaut wins another lane on its own. There are a bunch of weird things that this deck is able to put together. A lot of it is just power and oddities. This is what this deck is really trying to do. Double your Sage with Grandmaster or Symbiote Spider-Man. Play something like Rocket Raccoon and Symbiote Spider-Man. Rocket Raccoon, Symbiote Spider-Man, final turn, 15 points. That's actually something that's actually just very, very, very strong to do with anything that is playing Rocket Raccoon. And so this deck is basically built to confuse, distract, and make very hard to understand what your point output is going to be, where it is going to be, and how much it is going to be. Playing around all the stuff that goes tall, as well as the stuff like Juggernaut and Cosmo, is just very difficult to do. This deck is best understood as a deck that is similar to a bounce deck, but with a different setup process. Of course, we have the ability to do crazy stuff like Gwenpool Symbiote Spider-Man or Gwenpool Grandmaster. Tons of very interesting things can happen. Symbiote Spider-Man helps us save space in Hope Summers lanes if we're able to make that happen. It's not the most common thing because Hope Summers is actually the same energy cost or lower than many of our targets. But basically what this deck is trying to do is output points at a very efficient rate in very confusing ways, while taking advantage of the interaction afforded to you by Juggernaut and Cosmo. This deck was cooked up by Butt. It's had some good results and some bad results for several of my friends. I noticed Husky Puppies wasn't a big fan of it. I personally, it's very much up my alley. This is the kind of deck I enjoyed playing. I enjoyed playing a lot of No-Key. If you were the kind of small ball scalar game player that wanted to play a deck like No-Key still, this is a very interesting deck for you. It is a huge puzzle. There are so many weird little things you can do in these games, but fundamentally the puzzle is, what is the most points I can create, and what is my opponent going to play around? And if you solve that puzzle, you're going to win a lot of games because you can put a lot of points on the board. Finally, Norman. This is the deck, and I think if you were to go through this video, you would notice that the decks I'm playing are the one, like in rough order, with the possible exception of the last one, because I actually stopped the video, went to go play that deck so I could actually feel confident putting it on the video, and then put it on the video. So with the exception of that one, all the decks are in like descending order of how important Symbiote Spider-Man is to them. This is the deck that cares the absolute least about Symbiote Spider-Man. Everything I said about him in the Patriot deck is still true. It is the exact same card, literally just a 4/6 minor upside, totally replaceable. It's not bad, though. It's hard for Sandman to be bad. One of the things that you'll notice about this metagame is there are kind of a lot of decks that are playing multiple cards on the final turn of the game. There are a bunch of people playing bounce decks with Silver Sable. We haven't even covered those. There's the deck we just talked about. That deck loves playing cards on the final turn of the game. If you don't want people to catch you off guard, Sandman's a great option, and so you can play Symbiote Spider-Man in it. It's just, fine. It's a 4/6, right? Like the other options you have are stuff like Miss Marvel, right? Miss Marvel kind of sucks when you're an Ultron gamer. Symbiote Spider-Man saves you a space, gets you more points on the Ultron. It's a little bit better when you're playing Ultron. When you're playing Doom with Symbiote Spider-Man, you are able to play. I said Miss Marvel, I meant Captain Marvel. Anyway, when you play Doom with Symbiote Spider-Man, some of the time you're able to double it up. Most of the time it's not particularly relevant or you don't particularly need to. Overall, he's a good slot in here, but this is the deck that is already just good. It's not doing anything special with this card. It's just pretty good to play Symbiote Spider-Man with. Again, nothing wrong with that, but I do want people to understand that you don't need Symbiote Spider-Man to play Sandman right now, unless we figure out something that I currently have not figured out. All right, y'all. I hope you enjoyed that look at my top 7 day 1 Symbiote Spider-Man decks. I have never done a video this sort of intense before. Normally, it's like I've got one deck to talk about, but I think Symbiote Spider-Man genuinely deserves it because the card, and it is so weird, and there's so many places to try it, and it's the first activate card, and I think it's going to be a while before the heuristics around this card develop. Like, there's probably a lot of things that I'm saying that people are going to look back on in maybe a month or two and be like, this is stupid. Not necessarily that it's wrong, but that I feel the need to say it, because a lot of that stuff will probably go without saying at some point. Like, the same way we know a lot of stuff about the game now, the baseline level of knowledge is actually much higher than it was in the beta. More people know about more things. I expect the same sort of growth to happen with Activate, but honestly faster, because the players are better now. And so I think that this is the kind of thing that it's like, it's possible people look back on this video and be like, how did KM miss this? It's obviously good in thing we figure out 2 weeks from now. And I think that's entirely possible. I'm really interested to see what this guy can do, because early reactions have been so mixed across the board. People are saying it's busted. I think that was the title of Cozy's video. Dara thinks it's amazing. I think it's like pretty good, but it's so clearly like undiscovered territory for me that I feel like I'm only scratching the surface and I already think it's like, this is a pretty good card. I genuinely am fascinated to see how this develops. Let me know in the comments if you have any Symbiote Spider-Man decks that you think are incredibly amazing or anything like that. I, as always, have been KM Best. You, of course, have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.